Hey y'all, Coach in the Fight here, talking about the last Jubilee. Jubilee number 120 since the creation of Adam, and how we actually could be approaching that Jubilee. Now, this image that you're looking at is from a book that somebody wrote. I haven't had the chance to even see who the author of that book is. It was just that I found this as I went into Google to see if anybody else came up with the idea that we could actually be approaching the final Jubilee. And turns out somebody's actually gone in and wrote a book about it. I'm afraid to scroll down to see who it is, because there might have some images that we don't allow on our channels, on our videos over here. But if you all type in Jubilee 120 Jubilees, you'll find this book. And maybe one of you, if you read that kind of stuff, let me know what he says. But anyway, in this video, I'm gonna come in and show you what I've been working on and how it seems as though this could actually be correct. The year 2023, he's given well, I thought he said May of 2023. He's just saying 2023 in general, which, yes, it actually could be correct in that the 120 Jubilees could actually end in the year 2023. Now, what he's saying right there about the end of days, I'm not going to speak on that. I'm not going to try to predict the future, what could happen during that time. I don't know. But what this class will be about is just the math behind the 120 Jubilees and how it could actually be the year 2023, starting in the fall of 2022 and going through the year 2023. Now, let me show you the math on this. And just understand that the main reason why I'm doing this video is not really to give you guys all of the answers, but to actually pose questions. I'm actually hoping that some of you guys who are smarter on the subject than I am, could actually come in and try to help me to see where I'm going wrong. Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe I don't quite have the math right, and maybe I'm in error. And so I'm hoping that down in the comment section of this video we can try to work some of this stuff out. So I'll ask more questions and I'll give answers in this video, hoping that you guys will help me out. But let's get right into it. So let's start over here in Jubilees chapter 50. This is the book called Jubilees, and this is the only book in all of Scripture that tells us when the Jubilees occurred in biblical times. There are some books like Leviticus and Deuteronomy that talks about what you're supposed to do in Jubilee years, just like they talk about in sabbatical years. But they never tell us when those years were, when they fell, who did what, except for in the book of Jubilees. And that's what this entire book is about, is the timing of the Jubilees. And we want to jump down to the last chapter in this book. Again, like I said, it's the only book that talks about it. And so when we look in chapter 50 and verse 4, we're actually looking at the last known Jubilee year in all of Scripture. This is the last time that you can go to the Bible, go to any scripture for that matter, and find out when a Jubilee year is. I stress that because this is how we had to calculate when the next Jubilee year would be. This is how we know the Jubilee cycles was based on this information. So what you're seeing here, let me go ahead and read this verse. It says, "Wherefore I have ordained for thee the year weeks and the years and the Jubilees. There are 49 Jubilees from the days of Adam unto this day, and 1 week and 2 years. And there are yet 40 years to come for the learning of the commandments of the Lord until they pass over into the land of Canaan, crossing the Jordan to the west. So what this is telling us is that when they crossed the river Jordan, that was a Jubilee year. And I usually don't do this, and that's ask you guys to go over and watch a previous video that I put out. I kind of like for my videos to stand alone, but in that video we went through all of the efforts of actually proving this date and showing, all over the scripture using math, how we were able to determine and verify this date of this crossing of the river Jordan. So without going into all of that, I'm going to ask you guys to go over and look at that other video, but I'm just going to tell you what this year actually turns out to be. You see where it's talking about 24:50 a.m. That's talking about Anna Monday. That's talking about after the creation. And so that equates to 1457 BC, 1457 BC. I want to say 0.5 because it's actually talking about, it actually starts in September. All of the sabbatical and Jubilee years start in September, or in the fall. I shouldn't say September, but in the 7th sacred month, which usually lands in about September. So this will be about 1457, I'm sorry, 0.5 BC. Okay, so we're going to start off in the year 1457 BC. But now this was a Jubilee year. And what we really need to understand is the sabbatical year, because that's how we understand the Jubilees, is when we have 7 sabbatical years plus 1 year. So we're going to back up 1 year till we get to the sabbatical year. That would have been 1458. That would have been the last. That would have been the sabbatical year before the last known Jubilee year. So now let's let's progress forward to see how and where this falls around the second coming of Christ. Now, we remember from the book of Jubilees that the crossing of the river Jordan was in the 50th Jubilee, 50 times 49. And like we said, that equates out to 1457. So when we add another clip of 49 years, this time we're going to add 30 Jubilees to it. We end up in what appears to be 11.5. But remember, we have to add 1 year because there was no year 0. That takes us to 12.5, which is a sabbatical year. For some people, I have to keep saying, because I know some people are having a hard time remembering that we have to track the sabbatical years before we add 1 year for the Jubilee year. So that would mean that the fall of the year 13 BC was the start of the Jubilee year. But what's the significance of that year? When you look back in the biblical times, in the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, even in the apocryphal books, we don't hear anything about any events that happened in 13 AD. The Messiah was born in about 3 or 4 BC, and so we hear scriptural accounts of stuff that happened before 13 AD. He even came to Jerusalem when he was about 12 years old, so that would have been about the year 8 or 9 AD. But then we don't hear anything else going on until 26 BC, which was about 13 years after the Jubilee. So, what was the big deal about this 80th Jubilee? I should say this so-called 80th Jubilee falling in 13 AD. There was no significance to it whatsoever. But let me go even further into the future, and you'll see why I bring this up. So we're going to add another 49 not another clip of 49 years, but this time we're going to make it to 120 jubilees. So in the 1457, we actually have 50 jubilees, and then we see we have added 30 jubilees, and so we need another 40 jubilees to get to 120, and that actually takes us to 1973, or the fall of 73. So you say, well, what significant happened in the fall of 1973 or in 1974? When we go in and we ask Google what major events happened in 1973, the most important thing that it talks about is progress in the Vietnam War, how they are actually negotiating the Vietnam War. This is Richard Nixon. Now, of course, 1973 wasn't the beginning of the Vietnam War, and I don't believe it was the end of the Vietnam War. So the most important thing that happened in 1973 was peace negotiations related to the Vietnam War. Now, that would have been the in the fall of 1973 would have been the start of the Jubilee year, and so it would have continued through to the fall of 1974. And so you say, well, what was the most significant event in 1974? That was the Watergate scandal. Now, does that seem like what the father could be pointing to when he talks about the 120th Jubilee is a Watergate scandal? Well, I remind you of how after the 80th Jubilee, which should have been a big deal, we didn't actually see anything during that period either. In fact, the most important event in all of history happened after the 80th Jubilee, and I should say after the so-called 80th Jubilee. And so again, that's what brings us to what we're talking about here is, could we actually be looking for the significant events to occur after this 1974? Um, in other words, are we at it was 1974, the end of the 120th Jubilee, or was it actually the beginning of the 120th Jubilee cycle? Was it actually the beginning? And going back to the 80th Jubilee, that would mean if that in the year 13 AD, that would have actually been the beginning of the 80th Jubilee cycle, which means that we would have had the birth of the Messiah during the 80th Jubilee cycle. And so maybe if, and like I said, I'm asking questions here. If we are in the 120th Jubilee cycle, could we be expecting the return of Christ to be coming like the author of that book was trying to say, sometime in the year 2023? Well, let's jump back over to our calculator and let's start at 1973 as the beginning of the 120th Jubilee cycle instead of the end of the 120th Jubilee cycle. All right, so we have made it all the way up to the fall of 1973. And so what we'll do is we'll add another 49 years to it, and it takes us to the Jubilee cycle, or the Jubilee year that starts in the year 2022, the fall of the year 2022. So this is what that author would have been talking about when he was talking about the year 2023. Now, I'm not sure of his methods. Like I said, I haven't even, bothered to see who wrote the book, much less read it to see what he was talking about. But we want to see how this could be justified by way of scripture. So let's go and let's see if we can find any verses that actually support this idea. And the idea is that The 120th Jubilee year would be 2022 to 2023. So let's come back over to our calculator, and this time we're actually going to go back in time, starting from the year 1457 BC, which we said was the last known Jubilee year. Now, what we saw over in the scripture, over in the book of Jubilees, was that was 2450 Anu Monday. So what we'll do is we'll start from 1457. Again, we have to look at when the sabbatical year was. So we're going to back up 1 year just to get us to the sabbatical year. And then we're going to back up another, and I'm going to do it this way, 49 times 50. And that takes us to the year 3908.5. And so you say, well, what's the significance of the year 3908.5? That's not the date of creation at all. In fact, we know that the date of creation was 39.3.5. That takes us to 65 years. And if you're wondering where I got 3973 from, that's actually, let me back up and I'll show you. That's actually 4,000 years, because we know that the Messiah came exactly 4,000 years after Adam. So it's 4,000 years minus the first advent, which was in 26 AD. And so we end up in the year 65. And so you say, well, what is this 65 years? Where is this 65 years planned at? What's the significance of this 65 years? Because it's somehow playing a role in the calculation of the Jubilee years. Now, of course, to get any ideas on what's the significance of this 65 years, we have to come back over to the book of Jubilees. But instead of looking in the last chapter of the book of Jubilees, we're going to look in the third chapter of the book of Jubilees in verse 34. It's talking about Adam and Eve. Up in the previous verses, it talks about the times in which they were in the garden. Adam was in the garden for a number of years before Eve ever came to the garden. And we see right here in 34 that there was even a longer period of time before they actually had any children. It says, 34, and they had no son till the first Jubilee. And after this, he knew her, talking about Adam and Eve here, and how their first son was born. It says here, till the first Jubilee. So now we say, well, when was this? Well, we come over to the next chapter, verse 1, where it starts talking about Adam's children there. And we see that Adam's first son was actually born, I should say Eve's first son, was actually born in 65 AD. You see right there where it says, and in the third week in the second Jubilee, and it gives us a time there between 64 and 70 AD. So it's saying at this time that Cain was born was sometime between 64 AD, or I should say AM, before 64 Anno Mundi and 70 Anno Mundi. Well, we could tell from our calculation that this was actually 65. Because what we see over here in verse 34, that it was after the first Jubilee that Cain was born. And then we see over here that he was born during the third week. And that corresponds to what we saw about the 65 years. So that 65 years that we were saying about was actually the beginning of the Jubilee cycle. So, but was it the first Jubilee? And so here is the question that we have to answer. Now, was 65 or was 64 or 66, give or take a year, was it the first Jubilee in the 100 and Jubilee year cycle? So let's go back over to our calculator and let me show you what I think. So there is our calculation again that helping us get to and then see that the significance of this 65 years. But let's clear all of this out here. I believe we can start to understand when the Jubilee year was. Okay, so we're looking here at the sabbatical year. So let's go in and let's add 1 year for the Jubilee year. We said that the Jubilee year was in 1457. But now let's come back over to our calculation, and instead of looking at 50 years past the Jubilee, we're going to back up and we're going to say 1 year, and we see where we end up is 3858. So what this is saying, and you guys help me out if I'm missing something here. What this is saying is that the first Jubilee wasn't in 65, or it wasn't in the wasn't at the start of 65. What would that be? 3708. Yeah, 3908. That wasn't the Jubilee year. That was actually the start of the Jubilee cycle. With the birth of Cain was the start of the Jubilee cycle. And then when you come from that cycle and you add 49 times 50, you end up in 1458 plus 1 year will take you to the Jubilee of 1457. So instead of that being the end, that instead of that Jubilee being the end of the 50-year cycle, it's actually the beginning of the 50th Jubilee cycle. And so when we come in and we add another 49 years, let me get this right, plus 49 times, what we're going to do here, we got 50, so we're going to go 30. That takes us to 12 plus 1. That takes us to 13.5. That's actually the beginning of the Jubilee cycle, and which means that the Christ was actually born in the 80th Jubilee period. In fact, if we add another 49 years, we see that takes us through to the year 62.5 BC. And so you think of all of the events that happened from 13.5 to 62.5, and those would have been what would have happened during the 80th Jubilee, with one exception, one problem with this. And for that, we have to jump over to the book of Daniel. So let's come over here to the book of Daniel. In chapter 9, in a verse about 24, we see where Daniel is prophesying about the Messiah and all that would take place from the commandment to restore Jerusalem until the basically the second coming, or the kingdom age. There we see down here, you see it starts off in 24 talking about these 70 weeks, but then down here in verse 25 it talks about only 9 weeks before you would have the Messiah to come on the scene there. And he did. He actually came at 69 weeks, which turns out to be 26.5 BC. But then when you go down to verse 27, you see that the last week, instead of 69 weeks, it was supposed to be 70 weeks. Well, that last week was actually cut short. In the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice to cease, and you would have an overspreading of abominations. This is actually what they refer to as Daniel's 70th week. And we are actually still awaiting these events to take place today. Not only what you see in 27, but the rest of what you see in verse 24 as well. We only made it about 3.5 years from 26.5 BC until about 30 AD before the Messiah was cut off. That's why you hear people talk about the 70th week. We're still awaiting the 70th week. So let's come back to our calculator and let's look to see how we get to this decree that was supposed to be by Artaxerxes that you read about over there in Ezra chapter 7. Of course, now, so we started off with the last known Jubilee year here. You may have a hard time seeing it in that calculation, but you see right there where it says 49 times 50. So when you start off in 3973 plus the 65 years that we're talking about here, and then you add the 2450 years, and that takes you to the crossing of the River Jordan, or the last known Jubilee. And then from there we start calculating forwards to get to 457 BC, was when you had the commandment to restore Jerusalem by Artaxerxes. And in order to get there, we have to go an additional 20 Jubilee years plus sabbatical years, and that takes us to 457, showing that 457 was a sabbatical year. Okay, so now we need to step forward to fulfill Daniel's prophecy about the 69 weeks. So we're going to come in and we're going to add 69 times 7 plus 1 year, because there's no such thing as year 0. That actually brings us to 26.5, which was the first advent. And that's what Daniel was talking about when we would have the Messiah, the Prince. He would come at 69 weeks. But then when you read on in Daniel, he talks about the half a week and how in the midst of the weeks, in the midst of the last week, which would have been the 70th week, if we add one more week, that would have took you to 2033. That's when everybody would have thought that it should have all been over and done with when they made it to 33.5 AD. But it didn't. It actually got cut off halfway between that week. So you ended up with half a week there. So we take 7 divided by 2 and we end up in 30. And so that's actually the time when the Messiah was crucified. And notice for the first time that our 0.5 went away. The point, it don't get 30.5 like we've been talking about. And that's because the Messiah wasn't crucified in the fall, but he was crucified in the first month. But the thing about it is that's half a week. So you say, well, where is the next half of this week? And so that's what we have been in ever since the Christ was crucified. Since 30 AD, we've actually been in that 3.5 year period. That 3.5 year period has actually lasted for thousands of years at this point. And this is, like I said, this is what people are talking about when they start talking about the Daniel's 70th week. You look at all of that stuff that's going on in there. He said, finish the transgression. Well, you think we've still been transgressing the law since the Messiah hasn't ended yet. To make an end of all sins, yeah, we could only wish. People are sinning every day, even to this point. What this is talking about is the kingdom of heaven, when there will be no more sin whatsoever on the planet. He goes on to say, and to make reconciliation for inequity, that's actually talking about the tribulation period there. That's talking about the apocalypse. That's how you get reconciliation for all of the faults that were done, is we get to go through this tribulation and actually do just that, make reconciliation. And then he says, and everlasting righteousness. Again, this is talking about the kingdom of here, and we know that we haven't reached that point yet. He goes on to say, and to seal up vision. This is the visions that we've been talking about even back there. Back in the days of Adam, we were told about this kingdom of heaven and the prophecy and to anoint the most holy. That's actually talking about the second coming of the Messiah. This was all supposed to happen over this 70-week period. And we see down there in 27 that it was interrupted halfway through. It was actually interrupted in the year 30 AD. And we are still now waiting for these other 3.5 years to take place. Okay, so I see here that my math is starting to get a little bit complicated. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to save this information here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in to the year we know as the next Jubilee year, which is 2020. 2.5. Again, that's when we're going to start the Jubilee year in 2022.5. And so now we start to look at where is the second half of these weeks at this 70th week. Where would it be? So we start off in the year 22.5. But remember, that's the beginning of the Jubilee year. So we have to back up 1 year to take us to the beginning of the sabbatical year, which would be later on this year in 2021. And then we're going to subtract off 7 years or half of a 7 years, because we're looking for the second half of that 7 year week. And so we're going to take off 3.5 years, and that takes us to the spring of the year 2018. So now the question becomes, what happened to give us any type of indication that the spring of the year 2018 was the beginning of this second half of Daniel's 70th week? We had the first half back there with the Messiah, which I believe started with him taking his 12 disciples out into the wilderness there, where they walked with him for 3.5 years, learning the law, learning the covenant. And of course, it was cut short, and he was crucified at 3.5 years. Well, this other 3.5 years, he would have picked up where he left off with these individuals. It wouldn't be 12 individuals now. It would actually be, I believe, somewhere closer to 144,000 of them would have actually started their training or restarted their training sometime in the spring of 2018. So I don't know if there's anything we can see with these guys. Of course, they're supposed to be kind of hidden or whatever, but if any of them are watching this video, then they can actually maybe attest to this and say, maybe they can testify as to any significant events that happened in the spring of 2018. All I remember in 2018 was everybody was talking about the marriage supper that was supposed to happen in 2018. Well, thing about it, what jumped in my mind is I remember specifically how, during the Feast of Pentecost of 2018, everybody was watching the Prince of England getting married, so they was having their own kind of marriage supper. But I always thought that was some type of a distraction from what was going on, with the Father's people. But I don't know. Like I said, like I started off in this video, I'm asking more questions than I'm giving answers. So let's continue this discussion down in the comment section. If you got anything out of this video, hit the like button. If you didn't, hit the dislike button. But leave a comment either way. And shalom.